Hello, Dr. Taylor. How are you?
All right, how's everything?
Everything is everything. I was just at the Apollo last night. They had the office of the mayor, instead of having Gracie Mansion's African American or Black History event there, they had it at the Apollo, which I thought was really good.
Excellent.
Yeah, Harlem is getting the spotlight.
Indeed. Well deserved.
There's so much to talk about, and we are on YouTube Live, so just full disclosure.
Yes.
Um, the We Love Harlem initiative. I just want to let you know how it got started. You know a little bit of the history, or probably most of the history, but it was started by parents and teachers and administrators who served on the school leadership team of PS 175. We started having Martin Luther King Day events, which got more parents involved in the schools. Excuse me. And then we started realizing that parents didn't have all the resources that they needed to succeed. So we started having educational resource fairs and to get them more acquainted to the resources that are available to them throughout the community. And then last year, well, actually, after we had some successful Martin Luther King Day events, which you were there and a part of, and Unity in our community back in 2016, we we said we wanted to do a Black History event, and the principal said no, and we were like, what? This is Harlem. Like, you can't have Black history. You can't not have Black history in Harlem, because Harlem is steeped in Black history from the Harlem Renaissance all the way to the Gang of Four. I mean, everybody who paved the way for Harlem to be what it is today. And of course, Dorrance Brooks, which we're here to speak about today, the historic designation that you and others, I should say, were able to put in place to preserve the legacy and history of Harlem, which is extremely important right now. And you know all the reasons why. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions that we've asked. We've had these legacy interviews so far with Congressman Ringel, with C. Virginia Fields, with Hazel Dukes, and you are our fourth legacy interview so far. We have a few others to get to. But this is all a precursor to until we get to tomorrow's event, which might be a little curtailed because of the weather. We were going to have barbershop beauty shop talks, and we're still probably going to do them, but it's probably going to be a little more subdued due to the weather. But we want to hear directly from the people of Harlem, like their perception of what's happening with all of the new administrative changes and so forth. So, yes, please introduce yourself to the people who will be watching or are watching right now on YouTube Live, and we can go from there.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mari. And we, I don't think you mentioned that we served together for many years on the local community board, where you were active in the Economic Development Committee and other committees, and really sort of bringing new life and energy to that entity. So thank you for the work that you've been doing, both outside of the board and when you were on the board. I remember uh, quite vividly the effort that you put into that and that you put into everything. So thank you. Um, and I
Without you, of course.
yes, and I do have to mention that I am wearing. Let me see if I can put the camera
Oh
down.
no, here we go. Oh,
Just wanted to make sure you saw
I'm
that
gonna give you your love and
for,
respect because you do have a
for,
vice president in office. So good for you, for Howard. But
for all
really,
those
there would
Hampton
be no
folks that
Howard
may be
without
watching.
Hampton.
That's true. That is true. Uh, so my history, actually, if you want to see pictures and information about my family's history in Harlem, it's over 100 years. If you go to Taylor Made for Harlem and just click on About and Family Legacy, it'll show you actually the pictures of my ancestors that came to the United States from Barbados to Harlem in 1905 to establish a new life. My grandmother graduated from it was known as the School for Girls back in 1929. It's on 114th Street. I'm having a moment, but anyway, it'll come to me. It's a well-known Harlem school, which Wadley School for girls.
Wadley School for girls.
I have her yearbook. Her uncle was my grandmother's uncle was the first Black elected Democratic district leader in Harlem and in New York City. He was the first person of color to be a Tammany Hall representative.
Oh, Lord.
He had relationships with a lot of the folks that we read about in history books today, like Mary Cookman and one of the Gang of Four. I remember seeing a picture of him with whose granddaughter is now the deputy borough president.
Percy Sutton.
Yeah, so Percy Sutton. If you look on the street signs, you see the first firefighter. I believe his name was Wesley Williams, or was it Walker? Not quite sure. But I have a picture of my grand uncle with him, and on the back of the pictures, he was nice enough to write, what he was doing as the Harlem district leader. This is before there was a congressional seat representing this area, a Harlem congressional seat. And so his position really meant that he had to push for human rights, push for the rights of African Americans to participate fully in society, in employment, in service, in housing, in every aspect of life. And so he did run unsuccessfully against a gentleman named Adam Clayton Powell for that congressional seat, but he was also a successful business person and had a successful restaurant called the Monterey for many years, right across the street from the Harlem Renaissance Ballroom, which no longer exists, which brings us to my efforts to preserve the architectural and cultural legacy of Harlem through my efforts as the president of my block association, sponsoring successful efforts to get parts of Central Harlem landmarked at the federal, state, and now local level. Yesterday, we just had the unveiling, Wednesday, we just had the unveiling of the historic markers for the brand new Dorrance Brooks Square Historic District. Significance of that, Dorrance Brooks was a private first class Harlem hellfighter, died shortly before the end of World War I. Part of a group of individuals who knew that their role had two purposes. One, of course, was to fight on behalf of this country for democracy and to save France from Germany. But the second important reason that they were fighting was to show that African Americans could be loyal and brave and just as much a soldier and citizen as anyone else. And this was right around the time that Jim Crow was in full force. Lynchings were going on all over the country. They fought valiantly. They served on the front lines more than any other unit in the American side. They lost no ground. They reached the river, the Rhine River, which is the farthest into Germany of any American unit. And they lost considerable numbers. Well, the entire unit got the the Croix de Guerre, the highest medal that France could offer for its the bravery of its soldiers. The entire unit got it. So appreciative were the French of the efforts of the Harlem Hellfighters to save their existence. When they came back to the United States, they were not allowed to march down Fifth Avenue with the Rainbow Division, the other units, the white units. As a matter of fact, they weren't even allowed to fight with the white units overseas. They had to fight under the French flag because there was concern that the white soldiers, some of them, I guess, didn't want to be in a situation where they'd be equated with people of color on the battlefield, I guess. So they were not allowed to fight alongside the white American soldiers, and they were not allowed to get the services of the Red Cross nurses that that the white soldiers were able to receive when they were injured. But still, they fought, and when they came back to the United States, they were different. After they introduced jazz to Europe. James Reese Europe introduced, his band, and how are you going to bring them? How are you going to bring them back on the farm after they've been to Paris? The song that was similar to that, basically talked about the sentiment of how are you going to treat African American soldiers as second-class citizens in the United States after they've fought for this country.
And after they've learned in another country what freedom looks like, because when they went to France, they weren't treated like second-class citizens often.
Correct. Absolutely correct. They were different men coming back, and this did not bode well for Jim Crow. We have what's called the Red Summer 1919. It's red because of race riots and because of lynchings. And, occasionally Black soldiers coming back to their towns and their counties would be lynched in uniform because they were not willing to take a secondary role as a second-class citizen without the rights and without the rights that they fought for as soldiers for this country.
And I want to here for because, again, when we talk about mental health today, I think the origins of mental health begin right there, where, first of all, people of, African descent were brought over in ships to build America, and then were treated like they were nothing. I mean, it's right there. Then they go and they fight in a war. They give their lives and their bodies, and they give their, time and effort to fight for freedoms in America that when they got back home, they weren't even able to, partake in. And even the part where you talk about, where some white soldiers did not want to be on the battlefield with Black soldiers. I mean, imagine what that does to your psyche, and to your self-esteem and to your, personal mindset as a human being. You're like, I'm fighting. Not only have I helped build this country, but I'm now fighting for the freedoms of this country. And you don't even want to march beside me. It's just, when we talk about mental health, we should also think about that.
Mary, I have to sort of just add to that. It's not that Black people were considered nothing; they were considered property. And so the other thing too is it wasn't simply personal racial discrimination of, for instance, white soldiers not wanting to fight alongside Black soldiers. It was a structure of systemic discrimination that's told both white and Black soldiers that Black soldiers were not to fight on the battlefield. They were to be stevedores and um, assistance, helping to build roads and carry supplies, but not to fight on the front lines. That was a white man's job. So it was a systemic uh, process, not just an individual, I don't like you because you're Black situation. And that I think has been the case for the history of Black Africans in this country since, in New York City, at least since the 1620s when the Dutch brought them over.
Right.
Imagine, indentured servitude or slavery. It wasn't the same as the British version, and when cotton was king and all of that. The Dutch in the 1620s, they just sort of an outpost, a small little place. And so the Africans that were brought over, they were able sometimes to get their freedom and they were able to settle land. But let's say you're in the town and the town builds a big wall on Wall Street to keep out the Native Americans who are increasingly angry about the encroachment of the Dutch taking over the land. The Africans that were there were allowed to build homes on property outside the wall so that they could create a buffer between the Dutch population and the Native Americans further to the north. And so they still did that. They still, they settled the area outside the wall going north, creating that buffer. But their freedom was kind of what I call a half freedom, because they still had to pay an annual tribute or a tax to the Dutch West India Company, or else they could lose their freedom. And their children, when they were born, were considered enslaved. So they would have to try to somehow, fight for their freedom of their children. So that concept of freedom and home ownership and all of that is it's tenuous at best. But still, they fought, and the British took over. The new form of slavery was more direct in terms of its relationship to Africans and their designation as property. Even during the Revolutionary War, when the loyalists and the patriots were going against each other, the patriot and loyalist slave owners had no concern of freeing their slaves. This idea of fighting over freedom, liberty, justice pertained to the whites that existed during that time. And so Africans, as they fought in the Revolutionary War, wars after that, they were fighting for dignity, respect, and to the extent possible, their own freedom and the freedom of their families.
And as you're talking, again, the history being taught to our students is so critical. Again, last year when we had our Black History event, Mayor Eric Adams, at the time he was candidate Eric Adams, he came on and pledged that they would be, ensuring that that history is taught in the schools, the Black history is taught in the schools. And then Danique Miller, council member in Queens, allocated $10 million to the city budget so that could come to fruition. So we are going to be paying close attention to how this is rolled out. But as you're speaking of this, again, so many of our students are unaware of this history. I love that you brought up the Native American Dutch aspects, because that's on our flag of New York City. And I'm a direct descendant of the Lenape and Native Americans, unfortunately, who they say sold the island of Manhattan for $24 and, some trinkets, which I highly doubt, but we weren't there. So, but the history must be preserved. So going forward, how did you, so you obviously you had the impetus and the passion to and the unction to preserve this history. How did you go about it? Because you said from the federal, state, and local level, that has to be quite tedious.
Yes, we as a block association realized that we were not far from losing our neighborhood to the developers' wrecking ball. And by that, I mean there were churches that were bought by private developers, or at least one in particular, Mount Calvary United Methodist Church, where Shirley Chisholm first got her start working as a teacher for the nursery school there, right out of college. Uh, there is so much history woven into these buildings and structures that um, have existed over the past 100+ years, especially related to the Harlem Renaissance and then the civil rights movement. And so we realized that we needed to do more than lament the loss or potential loss of the buildings that make this quaint, beautiful neighborhood in central Harlem so special, and with its history related to the push for human and civil rights for African Americans, related to many of the buildings that are here. So to make a long story short, we got in contact with advocacy organizations like the Historic Districts Council and the West Harlem Community Preservation Organization, and they got us in touch with a architect who was a historic preservationist and helped us prepare our application to the state and federal historic organizations, State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service. And within 6 months of that submission, it was unanimously approved by the state. And 2 months after that, it was approved by the National Park Service as a district on the National Register of Historic Places. And so then that was great, but unfortunately, the legal protections that historic preservation as a district allow aren't really as strong at the federal and state level. It's the city protection level that is the strongest and is most difficult for redevelopment of historic locales. And so the city application was submitted shortly after we received the federal and state designation. And the Landmarks Preservation Commission was very attuned to our efforts and worked with us, along with all of the stakeholders, the Michael Henry Adams and Save Harlem Now, and all the entities that really felt strongly about supporting this effort. They did so, and the local neighborhood community paid for the study to be done by the architect. We paid the fees. We collectively fundraised, and so it was a group effort. And so when Landmarks Preservation Commission came back to us and said, well, we have been examining your neighborhood and we think that it has value, but we're going to add a few more blocks to it.
Wow.
To make it and so they did just that. They included, everybody's familiar with Strivers Row, and that, that distinctive neighborhood that Stanford White was the architect and made a beautiful community there. But the 2 blocks south were also had architectural value. 136th Street, 137th Street, from Adam Quaint Powell to Frederick Douglass, as well as the area from 140th to 136th west of Frederick Douglass Boulevard to St. Nicholas Avenue which was our original application. So the project ended up being a third larger than what we had anticipated. And I think it's something like 383 buildings or homes that are now part of this historic district, which it is adjacent to and connected to the Stravers Row Historic District. So it's really one big, massive area that is now protected for future generations.
Wow.
Not just African Americans, but New Yorkers and Americans and citizens of the world who may want to visit Harlem and see all the places that had such importance in the development of art and culture and civil rights and human rights and education, and the list goes on and on. They call it the Harlem Mecca for a reason, because of the contributions of all the Africans from the Caribbean, from the continent, from the South, from all over the world, who understand that Black excellence is something that is a part of the Harlem texture, part of the Harlem experience.
That is amazing. That is, and the whole diaspora got to, partake in that, and that's incredible. So I'm gonna now turn to some questions that I've asked Congressman Rangel, C. Virginia Fields, Hazel Dukes, and some of these are going to get very political. You ran for political office, and you have a lot of experience now. You're a seasoned professional in politics now. So some of these questions are going to get a little political, and I'm interested in hearing your responses based on comparing your responses with all of their responses against each other as well. So being that you've done everything you've done with Dorrance Brooks, this is amazing history and preservation that you did for the community. But what does Black history mean to you?
Black history means American history. It means the history of our forefathers, and not just the forefathers, but the women who contributed greatly and who are under-recognized now. When we think of the civil rights movement, we think of Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy, but what about Dr. Mamie Clark? What about an Ella Baker? Yeah. Those names should be as familiar to Americans in terms of understanding the civil rights movement as the men that were involved. So Black history and Harlem history are obviously intertwined. But the thing that I really want folks to understand is we will know when we will know as a society that we are reaching the ideals that we profess to aspire to in our written laws and constitution of equality, when it is not a first for a person of color or for a woman or for someone with disabilities to be an executive or to be a Supreme Court justice or to be, a significant person on the world stage. We will know that our classrooms are teaching history in a proper way when it is not a monthly celebration for African American history to be included in the teachings of American history. It's a part of, it's an intricate part of how this country was shaped and how this society exists now. So as long as we treat the idea of African American history as being something other than American history, then we're going to continue to suffer from the same problems that we've had
I hear
since
you on
the
all
country's
of
beginning.
that. I hear
So
that.
that's what Black history means to me. It's American history. That's what my bookcase behind me is filled with, so that
I love that. That is
my
amazing.
kids have that. That was a goal growing up to make sure that, and I never tired of getting books about
I was just thinking,
the struggle.
your children are so lucky to have that bookcase, to have all those books there, and to have you for a father, and to have their, just to have parents who are aware of preservation of history and knowledge and that sort. So, do you remember your first actual Black history lesson?
I grew up in upstate New York, a place called Kings Lodge. It was a resort started in 1937, one of many Black resorts that existed in the Catskills at the time, because at least partially due to the fact that Blacks were not allowed to go to other resorts. So they created their own. And so from 37 to 2001, my family owned and ran Kings Lodge. It was listed in the Green Book, which was started by a Harlem postmaster, by the way. And I think there was a movie that talked about the Green Book and focused on an individual who had to go to different places. People who don't understand what the Green Book is, it was a mode of allowing survivability for African Americans when traveling throughout the country. So it gave safe places for them to stay, for them to eat, places to avoid, like sundown towns. If you don't know what a sundown town is, that's a place where if a Black person was caught after sundown in the city or town, they might be killed. So sundown towns were very prevalent, and if you were traveling as African American, you had to really be careful in terms of where you went and who you traveled with. I mean, not who you traveled with, but where you were trying to get to. And so safe places were important, and African Americans throughout the country created their own hotels and restaurants and you know, places for people to visit. So the growing up in at King's Lodge meant that different organizations like the National Black Holistic Society would come to the lodge, and they'd have lectures, and folks like Charles Bell and and oh gosh, so many people, Betty Shabazz, just people who were stars in my eyes in the African American community would come to the lodge, as well as folks from the city and from Detroit and from Philly, regular folks that were bringing their families vacation. And so I grew up looking forward to my summers where my world would revolve around this little summer resort in Catskills filled with Black people coming from all over the place and just enjoying themselves. You know, and I had to work. I was, you know, part of the family, meant that I was part of the working staff, you know, doing dishwashing and then waitering tables and whatever else I needed to do, to running errands. But it was an incredible place to grow up in. So
Awesome.
it was more than a Black history lesson. It was a way of life. And once my dad passed away, my mom, you know, it was a lot to handle. And there were also other issues around integration and its effect on Black businesses and Black clientele. If you are forced to go to certain places because white establishments won't allow you to go, what happens when that opens up and you're able to travel the Caribbean unimpeded, or, you know, hotels throughout the world? Then the Catskills may not be as appealing as the rest of the world. So integration was wonderful in that African Americans were no longer treated as second-class citizens, but also meant that some businesses suffered. Same thing with schools. Having segregated schools meant that you had an infrastructure of Black teachers and principals, administrators, and students who were able to learn in an environment that, even if it were under-resourced, they didn't have to deal with the severe pressure of racial hatred as they were trying to learn. And so once integration took place and schools were integrated, that meant that those Black schools closed down, and or if they survived, they were under-resourced. So it's been an interesting experience, to say the least. I certainly am very grateful for the opportunity to be able to tell the story of so many efforts to fight for equality.
Yes.
So many people who have worked hard to make life better for others, and their legacy needs to be not forgotten. Their names need to be remembered, and they need to be revered.
Absolutely.
And we'll know when we've reached a better place in society when everyone in society knows their names, and it's nothing special for them to be celebrated for the sacrifices they made.
Understood. Got that all day. Now, you mentioned your family members who have ran for political office and served in politics, and then you have also carried that legacy on and ran for political office. So do you think it was and still is hard to be a Black politician? Why or why not?
I would, I ran for political office, but I've never held political office. But I would think that in addition to all the complications of the job, there are probably attitudes that are unfavorable for people of color that exist regardless of whether you're in political office or whether you're in a business or whether you're in the, whatever it is, wherever it is that your life takes you. As a country, we still are dealing with the legacy of structural and systemic discrimination. We still are not at a point where it's normal to have Black Supreme Court justices or Black heads of Fortune 500 companies or Black individuals in STEM fields, in technology. There are efforts, obviously, and there have always been efforts, but those efforts are an uphill battle because we're fighting this legacy of hatred and bigotry.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. So being that you never held political office, but you did run, what are 3 lessons that you learned in running and that you would share with aspiring younger politicians?
Make certain that you have an organization that will help will grow and expand as your efforts to run go forth. So you have to really try to. I would think perhaps volunteering for political campaigns, getting an understanding of how they work, and then preparing your own campaign to really be able to handle all the different types of issues that may come up. Uh, Primarily, are the financial issues are the you know, the dominant types of problems, but also in terms of getting good staffing, having the folks that you need to have in order to do the outreach that's necessary, because it, it it is a good thing to run. I'm certainly glad that I did run, but it is a real commitment of time and energy and resources. So you have to be prepared for that. Also, have a thick skin. You're running against candidates, and they all have to show why they're better than you. So they may say things that are not flattering, and they may or may not be true, but you have to be able to understand that, you know, that's being done not because you're a bad person, but because they want the same thing that you want, and they're doing whatever they need to do in order to get that position. So you know, those are a couple of little pointers, I think.
Curveball. Would you run again?
I never say never. You know, it's just having the support, obviously, that would be needed to do so, and I'd have to make certain that the skills that I have would really help people in for whatever position I'm running for. I wouldn't run simply to put a title on my resume or run so that I could run for something else. I would run because I would be committed to the service that would be required for that position.
Got it. Do you think a perfect Harlem can exist? And if so, what does it look like?
A perfect Harlem. Well, we can go beyond Harlem, because Harlem is sort of a creation of redlining and migrations, and so it's Harlem is it has the same kinds of positives and negatives of the Harlems all over the country and perhaps the world. What would make it perfect would be robust efforts, obviously, to rid society of current and historic systemic discrimination. We look at Harlem, it's an area that is predominantly African American. That's part of it is because African Americans and others, you know, Africans throughout the world, saw it as a place to live. But there are other places throughout the city that are very enticing that African Americans could not live, no matter how much money they had to purchase it. So that was a part of how Harlem was formed. There are also situations like, as you have brought out plenty of times, Seneca Village, where you have a African American community, predominantly along with other German and Irish immigrants in Central Park, but through urban renewal get wiped out. And there's urban renewal examples throughout the country of strong African American communities that got torn apart. Part of FHA, you know, the redlining, the whole thing with FHA, part of their underwriter manual talked about how it was important to separate white populations from others. Populations, they didn't want any kind of neighborhoods where you had diversity. Diversity was the enemy. And one of the things they talk about is highways are a good way to split neighborhoods up. So,
Yeah,
you know,
the
so
power
you
vote.
look at the design of highways, and you don't really think about the racial origins
Mhm.
of how some of these highways were designed. Some of them may have been put right through vibrant African American communities, and so we lost a lot. We lost not just our communities, but we lost the history, we lost the architecture and the culture of having these neighborhoods destroyed. Robert Moses
Yep.
should be a familiar name. I don't think he was a fan of preservation. So
Yes.
the fact that Harlem has, you know, in my humble estimation, been dis disinvested of resources in terms of development for decades means that we don't have the development that you see in other parts of the city. So we have a rare opportunity to preserve the buildings that were made 100+ years ago. And in doing so, we're also preserving the cultural aspect of that, the connecting of the um, Black excellence that existed and thrived in these neighborhoods, lived in these buildings, had their organizations here. Uh, Everything from the March on Washington to the NAACP's efforts, going from the end, well, yeah, the end of World War One up until the present day, because we're still here.
Yes. Okay, and for the last question, and I have to preference this with a quick story about Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter, there were a few years ago, I think this was during when Bernie Sanders was running against Hillary, they stated that, you know, Black people just shouldn't vote. Like they were not going to vote at all. And it was kind of a strange time in politics, but they were just giving voice really to a great number of younger generations who just do not, first of all, they don't know the history of Black people voting, obviously, but the other part is that they just feel disconnected from politics at all. Like they just are disenchanted. They don't believe politicians do anything at all. So what advice or nuggets of wisdom would you give the younger generation that believes politics don't work?
Learn about their history in terms of the struggles and severe challenges faced by uh, past populations of African Americans that did not have the rights, the suffrage rights, the rights for equality, and see what kind of suffering they went through. African Americans, after getting their freedom from slavery, fought for the right to vote. They understood the connection between voting and power, the ability to decide what happens to your community is directly related to the ability to vote in your leadership that reflects your wishes. So it doesn't, I'm 56 years old, and within my lifetime, these struggles were real. Virginia versus Loving was in 1967, and that was a Supreme Court decision that legalized relationships between African Americans and marriages between African Americans and Europeans in this country. That was 1967. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, allowing people of color to vote, even though we had amendments 100 years prior to that, the 14th, 15th Amendment, and the 13th Amendment, that stated that those rights were bestowed upon any citizen of the United States. So if you don't understand the history of this country and the relationship of people of color to getting their rights to be treated as equal human beings, then unfortunately, we're going to continue to suffer the same problems as a result. So if they want to avoid making those mistakes of becoming disenfranchised as citizens, then they need to be involved, be vigorously involved in the democratic process that this country has.
Mm-hmm. Very great. This was excellent. And we're going to share some of the highlights from the Dorrance Brooks Historical District marker that you guys did on Wednesday with the audience as well. I'm going to put my camera on for a minute. So thank you so much for taking time out and sharing this wonderful story, your history, your legacy, and your passion for preserving the legacy and history of Harlem. We really, we honor you, and I personally have great, memories of you being a mentor to me. So thank you so much for everything you've done. And you're very young still. So I'm laughing while I'm asking you these questions because, we were talking to Congressman Ringel, and he's like, now I'm 90, he's like, I'm in my 90s, So it's like, it's funny to talk to you and you're like in your 50s. But anyway, thank you so much for sharing your time and energy and effort in this regard. And again, we have a lot of work to do to uphold the legacy and history of Harlem as it is gentrified. I hate to use that word, but as you drive throughout Harlem or even walk through Harlem, you see, I never thought I'd see the day where the National Black Theater is gone. Like, never thought I'd see that day. And you just see, like, there's so many open, or as the developers call them, soft spots for development. And you just hope that, when you look at the district needs of the community, that they're being met with action on, okay, you're going to build your business here, employ people from the community. If you're going to build affordable housing here, this is our median income. We need people that make this kind of money. We need so many apartments for for people who fit those income gaps. If we want to lower the poverty rate, we want to lower the unemployment rate. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm glad that you're still at the forefront of making sure that these things come to fruition.
I'm honored to be a part of it, and certainly honored to know you. So thank you. You keep doing the wonderful work you're doing as well.
Thank you, Dr.